So the first thing I wanted to show was what my VimRC looks like right now, because I did have a couple mistakes that I had in some past videos, so I'm just going to show the proper way of doing what I've done so far, at least a more proper way than what I was doing. So now if we come on to the Raspberry Pi, since that's a nice place to use SSH, I'm just gonna, or a nice place to use Vim, I should say. Let me find some sort of file that I want to maybe modify. Okay, first of all, we are actually talking about my VimRC file. If I go back to my home folder and load my VimRC, this is what I have now. Actually, this is wrong. So if I want to bring these two lines down into one line, I just do set number then relative number right here. This will do exactly the same thing as what I had before. So this is how you condense it into one line. And then this is how I remap J and K, and it works in all modes, even visual, which is pretty nice. So rather than saying like nmap and vmap, just no remap does everything. And then this is how I have it properly indent Python code. This is what AI suggested that I did. Might not be the right way to do it necessarily, but it definitely works. As you saw earlier, if you're watching the original video that I'm recording here. So this is how I deal with indentation stuff. So now that I've shown that, I think I'm going to show how I do it in Obsidian, because I've had some mistakes on my Obsidian's VimRC as well. So of course Obsidian's what I use for my note-taking software and where I keep track of stuff. What I love about it is you can use Vim on Obsidian. As you can see, I'm going up and down using Vim, blah blah blah. So that's pretty nice to have. But let's look at my VimRC, because I had some mistakes on there in the past. So this is how I remap my J and K keys on Obsidian. And I'm using an Obsidian plugin called VimRC Support to use that VimRC configuration in Obsidian. No remap JK and then KJ. That does actually work just fine. So one thing I was experiencing before that was when I went from line to line, I wasn't really getting the behavior I expected. So I'll just yank these three lines and put it in the end as an example. So this line technically goes over the course of two lines. Even though it's one line, it looks like two. You can tell based on the line number here. So what I used to have that was incorrect was I had a G right beforehand. So now if I reset Obsidian, so I'm still on line 29 despite the fact that I'm jumping between these right here. And that's because what I used to have was this right here. This was actually nmap than this. But if I change it to no remap and remove this G part, then it works as you would expect, which I originally showed in the first place. So if I were to reopen my vault, now you'll see the way it behaves is it just jumps right to the next one. That's the behavior I want. If I want the other behavior, then I do with the G, whatever, the GK and GJ right there. So that was a mistake that I previously had, but this is my VimRC for the Obsidian. And I use a plugin so I can read that file. So while we're at it, I'll show kind of how I accomplish all the other platforms too. So on Atom, I have an Obsidian plugin for that as well. So to access that, I just go to Settings, Packages. I think this will show the packages I have installed. I'm using Vim Mode Plus to basically use Vim on here. And my key mappings are in the typical keyboard shortcuts. So if you go to your key map just in general, This is how I remap J and K in Atom. So that's the syntax I used, and that's how I have J and K the way I want it to be. What's intuitive for me, which is the opposite of the default. That's how I do it in Atom. And then the way I accomplish it in NetBeans, I have Vim and NetBeans as well. I have a plugin called JVI. If I go to the plugins, if I go to preferences, JVI config, under the map commands right here, this is how I map the shortcuts. And I think I have to have a G right there or else it'll error out. But this is a syntax that I use to remap J and K on JVI, which works pretty well. Unfortunately, it doesn't support relative line numbers, so I just kind of have to suck it up. And then in Visual Studio, which I don't have a convenient environment right now, I just manually run the colon commands using VS Vim. I just run the colon commands manually. I only have to run it every time I launch Visual Studio. Once it's launched, then it will continue to work. Relative line numbers doesn't really work in there either. So that's kind of how I have my VimRCs in all these different environments and how I have that set up basically. So yeah, that's basically my VimRC in a nutshell.